kinks in our new virtual environment. Welcome to New Space Chicago. I know that many of you are familiar with what we do, but we're here to promote the new space industry in the Chicago area. And we're very happy that you could join us tonight, even if it's a small group. So we look forward to more of these events, and hopefully things will run a little more smoothly next time. So this evening, we're happy to have Charles Mudd as our main speaker. I'm sure many of you know Charles. He is the founder and principal of Mudd Law Offices, and he has developed a broad-based practice representing local, national, and international clientele in diverse litigation and transactional matters, with offices in Chicago, Houston, and Park City. And he's become internationally known on issues of technology, intellectual property, and the internet. Regularly speaks on these topics at venues such as South by Southwest, iTech Law, and multiple bar meetings internationally. He's taught courses at John Marshall Law School, the University of Connecticut School of Law. Charles has become very interested in the topic of space law and has positioned his firm and practice at the forefront of space law and the expanding commercial space industry. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Charles for tonight's presentation on the satellite regulatory regime. Charles, take it away.
I appreciate the introduction, and I will now share my screen, and hopefully this is going to be moving forward without that's kind of a weird thing. All right, so what I'm going to do is give a presentation here on, let's see if this works for the wrong screen. Hold on, we do have some, give me just a second. I can move this over here and oh no, it's not. It's gonna share it over here. All right, give me just a second while we work out these kinks on the technology side. I am going to let's see, I can think just a second. Give me just a moment here while we figure these technical difficulties out. And I'm going to share. If I share this one, then move over here. You all wanted this to happen, didn't you? You wanted me to. All right, there. You all should see, if I'm doing this right, the full New Space Chicago logo, and now you are looking at the screen, looking forward into the satellite regulatory regime. I'm happy to be here again. I appreciate New Space Chicago inviting me once more to speak on a matter relating to space law. You can always reach me. I'm happy to converse and discuss as much as you'd like. So after the presentation, I'm happy to take questions, and certainly please feel free to contact me from there. So what do I want to talk about today? Within the satellite regulatory regime, there are a number of aspects. And so I want to touch a little bit about international law. I want to then dive into the regulatory regime. I'm going to come in and focus on one particular aspect, albeit hitting some other issues on the sides, and then kind of looking forward into what might happen over the next year or two in the regulatory space with respect to satellites, and then finally open it up for comment. As we all know, or most of us may know, the primary space-related agencies are NASA, NOAA, the FAA, and the FCC. are more nuanced agencies that might be specifically tasked, or departments rather, within these specifically tasked to the space aspect. But these are the four primary agencies. And from the private perspective, you might primarily be dealing with the latter three, although any SBI grants or collaboration with NASA, particularly as the public-private intersection continues to grow, you might interact with NASA as well. But starting with NOAA at the top, for example, I want to talk about the commercial remote sensing regulatory affairs. So within NOAA, the CRSRA is the particular aspect that deals with the commercial side of remote sensing, or satellites that would look back to Earth for whatever purpose and in whatever kind of metric or observational, whether it be infrared, optical, and so forth. Essentially, it's very clear in the regulations and the statute that no person who's subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. may operate any private remote sensing space system without a license, and they must be authorized by the Secretary of Commerce to license the private sector parties to, or the Secretary of Commerce is authorized to license private sector parties to operate private remote sensing space systems. So essentially, no person can do so without a license, and the Secretary of Commerce, or the Department of Commerce, is the body that is provided the authorization to license, and that's through NOAA and then the CRSRA. So it focuses on licenses, of course, as we just mentioned, annual audits. There are definitely regulations, there's audits, there are quarterly audits that you might end up having to do. So NOAA is a key aspect. Any satellite, any aspect of a satellite that's looking back to Earth, taking imagery and so forth, needs to go through NOAA. Of course, as within any agency these days, and with any actual implementation of a plan or mission, you need to have a cybersecurity aspect and have a data protection plan in terms of how you're going to approach and secure the data that you end up, that the satellite ends up obtaining. So NOAA does have a data protection template to be working through with specifics that you need to provide. And even within the CRSA, though, there exists coordination outside of NOAA in other agencies. And this is particularly with respect to the data protection, cybersecurity, ITAR and EAR, which I'll mention here in just a minute. And primarily those are going through the Department of State, the Department of Defense, Department of Interior, and the Office of Director of National Intelligence. So we have here a document that's Memorandum of Understanding among many of these agencies relating to the licensing and operations of private remote sensing satellite systems. And in fact, recently these regulations were updated. And as we'll see in the presentation, the regulatory aspects of satellites have really been undergoing a regulatory update over the last couple of years. And that starts here, particularly with respect to this presentation with the NOAA and the remote sensing regulations. So they were updated in May. Now let's turn to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, in particular, the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. The enabling statute, which is the statute that provides for that particular application or that particular agency or department, is the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984. And since then, the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004. So those are the primary statutes. However, the enabling regulations, which get down into more specific operations of the particular agency, are at 14 CFR, which is Code of Federal Regulation, Chapter 3, Parts 400 to 460. You've all read the reading assignment for today's presentation. There will be a quiz in 20 minutes, and you'll be told whether or not you passed. I'm just joking. There's no quiz, and there was no reading assignment that you missed. But nonetheless, the point that I'm trying to make is that in any regulatory aspect, there are a number of regulations. We start at the level of statutes, which are enacted by Congress, and then, well, passed by Congress, enacted as well, but with the signature of the president. And then once we have the statutes, the different agencies promulgate regulations. One thing to keep in mind is that regulations, amendments to regulations, and license applications, all of that goes through public comment periods. So any changes in regulations can be commented upon by anybody, something to keep in mind. It's less so obviously with the statutes. You can write into your senator, your representative, president, so forth. But with regulations, you're able to go online and submit, and we'll see that a little bit later. So we have the FAA and the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. What do? Well, they regulate the launch or re-entry of vehicles, regulate launch sites, experimental permits for reusable suborbital rockets, safety approvals, pre-application consultation for the launch or re-entry vehicles, and that is a requirement, policy review and approval, safety review and approval, payload review and determination. They talk about financial responsibility, environmental review, compliance monitoring, and much more. Now, just to give you kind of an idea of what we're talking about here in terms of spaceport licenses, launch licenses, how many are we talking? Well, in terms of the actual spaceport licenses, we've got about, there's 11 right now. There used to be, I think, one more. There are some applications pending, but we've got Florida, Houston, Jacksonville, again, Florida, Texas has 2, Florida has 4, although these are kind of, they are the same space, more or less. California, New Mexico, Alaska, Colorado, and Virginia. In terms of licenses for launch licenses with respect to companies that have the license to actually launch as opposed to being a launch site, there are many more than just the launch sites. You can find any of these applications and their comment period, the comments that were made, the regulatory response online. It's all available. For the FAA, you can go to regulations.gov and search in the parameters. And again, I'll show you hopefully here in just a little bit more. They also deal with experimental permits and safety approvals of that through the FAA and the OCST. Before leaving the FAA, talking about that aspect, I'd like to mention that they also regulate moored balloons, kites, amateur rockets, unmanned free balloons, and certain model aircraft. Drones have become very big over the last couple decades. They are encompassed within the FAA too. And as we mentioned before, with respect to NOAA, having new regulations that came out in 2020, the same with the FAA relating to new launch and reentry regulations. Those become effective March 10th, 2021, so coming up here in just a few weeks. And then some of those, however, some of them are accessible, are going to be effective 5 years from then. And then finally, there's an asterisk in that any of these new regulations have an information collection requirement, which basically the Office of Management and Budget looks at these new regulations to assess the imposition on information collection. What is the information collection burden, the paperwork burden, and so forth. So some of those aspects might, in various situations, be waiting for further regulatory development. But we have NOAA new regulations, May 2020. We have FAA launch and reentry regulations that have been amended, effective, many of which are coming up here in 2021, March 10th. And then what about the FCC. Well, before we get to the FCC, we've just talked about those things, so I'm going to skip ahead. We've talked about NOAA. We've talked about the FAA. Before we get to the FCC, I want to talk about ITAR and EAR. Go to the New Space website. I believe that they may have a link or a video, perhaps. But we did do a presentation on ITAR and EAR some time ago for New Space. But essentially, ITAR is the International Traffic in Arms Regulation and regulations, and then EAR is the Export Administrative Regulations. They basically do the same, govern the same purpose, or they have the same purpose, but ITAR is much more strict in certain respects than EAR. What is the purpose, you ask? Essentially, ITAR and EAR govern the ability for a U.S. citizen or a U.S. company to share certain technical information that fits within certain categories with parties outside the United States. And that applies even, fortunately or unfortunately, to an intern or an employee who happens to not be a U.S. citizen. ITAR and EAR applies in that circumstance. The penalties for violating ITAR and or EAR are significant, so it's not something to play around with. It's definitely a reason to be careful. And in fact, you may have read stories about SpaceX and other agencies just not even dealing with the issue because they don't want to have a situation where they're going through that process of getting a license to allow certain individuals access to certain information. So if you hear about a company focusing only on U.S. citizens, there may be a reason behind that, and that could very well be ITAR and EAR. We've talked about NOAA. We've talked about FAA. So let me give a little context here. So the FAA, as you may know, regulates the launch site and the launch of the vehicles, satellites. So that's from ground to getting into orbit. That's really the FAA. Once you're in orbit and you're operational, the NOAA focuses on any aspects of the satellite that might be looking back toward Earth. What about communications? Well, that, of course, would be the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. One of the big issues that has come up with satellites in the last couple of years is orbital debris or space debris. Essentially the same term. If you're in the EU, it's space debris. If you're here in the United States, it's orbital debris. Why care? Well, the Kessler syndrome talks about this, and essentially we have a concern that at some point there may become so many satellites that we reach a situation where one satellite colliding with another creates enough debris that sets off a cascading event, that debris collides with other objects, and it just continues to escalate from there. The issue of orbital debris, though, and the reason that I want to circle back on this and
I think Charles is having some internet connectivity problems. Hopefully he'll come back here in a minute. Charles, you're frozen. I don't know if you're hearing us. Charles? Looks like Charles is having some technical difficulties. Let's see if we can get him back here. So I'm attempting to contact Charles through texting, so hopefully we can get him back here in a minute. And unfortunately, I'm not getting any text back from Charles. And because he was the host for the system, I can't put us back into the virtual environment, into the networking room. So we're kind of stuck here for now. So in the meanwhile, let's see if I can put up, it's going to let me do that. No, it's not. Well, I'm sorry that our presentation this evening was abruptly terminated. So I think unless we can get Charles back here very quickly, we'll have to just leave it at that for this evening. In the meanwhile, let me just mention that our next event will be on March 16th. And we're very happy to have retired Air Force Colonel Coyote Smith, who will be presenting a presentation entitled Avoiding the Dragon's Trap, which is about China's aspirations in space and the opportunities and challenges presented by that. So hopefully we'll have better luck with our technical systems next month. The event next month will be at 6 p.m. Central Time, so same time, and it'll be on March 16th. Yeah, so I think we're all just going to have to leave the environment. So Jessica and Nick, you guys should probably just quit, and we'll have to leave it at that.